Before I get into the type of diseases this organism causes, I want you to remember these little things back here. This is a very virulent organism. It's very pathogenic. And here's some reasons why. It produces a whole bunch of different things that actually allows it to be virulent. For example, this carbohydrate I mentioned. So this is on the surface of the cell. It protects against lysozyme. This is an enzyme that breaks down bacterial cell walls. So remember peptidoglycan? You have lysozyme in tears, you have lysozyme in saliva. This enzyme sees bacteria and it breaks down the cell wall. But that carbohydrate protects the bacterium from lysozyme, all right? We talked about fimbriae, if you remember. This is a type of pilus. In fact, you studied this for your exam, but it allows bacteria to stick to tissues, all right? So this is a pilus, allows adherence there. The M protein you also find on the surface here of the cell, right over here, all right? It helps protect the organism from phagocytosis. This is your white blood cells trying to chew that bacterium up. It also produces hyaluronic acid. So hyaluronic acid is something like what you have in your tissues. So the organism can actually survive in your tissues. It has something that looks like what you have in your tissues, so it can evade an immune response. And then it has a protein called C5a peptidase. This also protects the organism from degradation by neutrophils. Those are white blood cells. So those things I'd like you to know. There are other factors that's involved, but those are the 5 things so far, all right? Okay, so let's get to it. So we're going to look at Streptococcus pyogenes, one organism. This is the microorganism. And we're going to look at the major diseases that's produced by this organism. Because we're looking at respiratory tract infection, I'm going to focus on the first one, all right? This disease is called Streptococcus pharyngitis, or streptococcal pharyngitis. That's a technical term for something you've already heard, strep throat. So I can use these figures here to actually show you what the patient has. So imagine somebody has strep throat, they come to your nurse, they open them, they have the patient opens his mouth, and what you see are inflamed tonsils right here and right there. All right, and this is the uvula. All right, so this is smack in the middle. You can see inflammation occurring, reddening. These tonsils are swollen. Inflammation on the palate, on the tonsils itself. Sometimes you see white spots. The first thing you think about that is that person has Streptococcus pyogenes. So the top of the list, when we look at disease caused by Streptococcus pyogenes, one of the major diseases, it is strep throat. Now, sometimes this can resolve pretty nicely. Well, within a week or two, the patient is happy even without treatment. But take a look at this picture back here, this one, all right? So again, same organism, you have a different type of disease. It started as strep throat, and now this spreading. This is called a peritonsillar abscess. See all those white spots? There's pus in here and everything. Again, this is a really nasty disease. It started like this, and it ended like this. You see this typically in people who are immunocompromised, like AIDS patients, or old people, or very old people, or very young people. All right? Okay, so again, the number one problem is strep throat is caused by this organism. Now, there's some other diseases. So this is respiratory diseases. The first one is Streptococcus pyogenes. First disease is streptococcal pharyngitis, or strep throat. Now, here's the thing. This one organism can cause many other diseases that might not be in the respiratory passages, but I want you to know what they are, right? You probably heard about scarlet fever. So scarlet fever is caused by the same organism, but a different strain of this organism. So it's the same bacterium, except it has new genetics, all right? So scarlet fever is defined by these rashes on the skin. Oops. You see these rashes on the skin here? There's a reason why these strains can do this. All right, there's bleeding that occurs under the skin. All right, with that pen. So there's a skin rash that occurs. Now here's the reason why. This special strain produces a very potent toxin, and I want you to remember it. It's called an erythrogenic toxin. Erythro refers to red. That refers to the rash that this person has. This toxin destroys capillaries. So when it destroys capillaries break up, and then what happens, you have blood seeping into tissues. So under the skin back here, or in the skin itself, you have blood and tissues. Why? It's because that strain produced this toxin, a erythrogenic toxin that destroys capillaries. All right, so that's one thing I'd like you to know. Scarlet fever, it's a rash disease. It's caused by streptococcus pyogenes, the same organism that causes strep throat, except it's a different species. This species produce erythrogenic toxin that causes capillaries, blood vessels, to break down. So blood seeps into tissues, and now you have these rashes. Now, the third thing I want you to know about this one, the reason why this strain can do this is because it has a virus in it. So here's a bacterial virus, and haven't talked about viruses yet, but this is all I want you to know. That viral DNA gets chucked into the chromosome of the bacterial cell. So here's the bacterial DNA. This virus comes in, it takes its DNA and puts it into the chromosome. This is called a prophage. The gene for this toxin, it's actually encoded for by the viral DNA. So if I take the virus out, this bacteria can't cause scarlet fever. All right? Now, the way we treat this disease is by using an antitoxin. It's the toxin that's causing a problem. So if you use an antibody against the toxin, you can neutralize the toxin, and then a person can recover. All right? So this is another disease that's caused by streptococcus pyogenes. Now, there's some other diseases that I want to mention here. Rheumatic fever, it's also caused by streptococcus pyogenes. But this is an autoimmune disease, all right? In this case, this is rheumatic heart disease. So this is taken from autopsy from a 13-year-old kid, all right? Typically, you see this in younger people. This is the heart valve here. If you guys remember your anatomy, this is the chordae tendineae. Remember those strings that we saw in the heart from last semester if you've taken 153? And then you see a lot of destruction of the tissues here, all right? So this is called rheumatic heart disease. So here's what happened in this patient. That person has strep throat. Now this is a rare condition, by the way. That person has strep throat, and they produce antibodies to the bacteria. In other words, their white blood cells did what they're supposed to do. They produce an antibody. But in these unfortunate individuals, molecules on the surface of their tissue resembles what the bacteria have, all right? So now their own antibodies start attacking themselves, all right? You start destroying tissues because this is an autoimmune disease now. So basically your own immune system is attacking your own tissues, and this can result. Same thing occurs with acute glomerulonephritis. So this is the kidney taken from autopsy. You can see destruction here of the kidney, all right? The reason why antibodies are produced in the patient, it binds to a protein called M, all right? You form these huge complexes, and these complexes collect in the kidney, and it actually induces a very strong, powerful immune response. So there's lots of inflammation and tissue destruction, right? So here's what I mentioned to you so far. Streptococcus pyogenes, the primary disease, is strep throat. We saw the condition there, right? It can also cause rheumatic fever. Can also cause acute glomerulonephritis and scarlet fever. Those are all examples of disease that's caused by this organism. Other things that can be caused by the same organism. Erysipelas, eri refers to red. So if you notice here, this person has a lesion on the face, it's pretty red, fiery red. It's because this organism can produce a toxin that can cause this problem here. Peripheral sepsis, also called childbed fever, all right? This happens in pregnant women who deliver their babies vaginally. And of course, you have tissue breakage. If the organism is present in the vaginal tract, they penetrate into tissues. And of course, it can cause a serious infection. It occurs generally within 1 week or so after childbirth. All right? Bacterial is just a general term. Excuse me. All it means is bacteria in the bloodstream. So emia refers to blood. That tells you bacteria in the bloodstream. Septicemia, all right, this is bacteria and their toxins in the bloodstream. So another disease that's caused by this organism is necrotizing fasciitis. And again, you probably know this best as the flesh-eating disease. And I'll show you a picture of this. Okay? This is a very bad disease. Progresses pretty rapidly. In a couple of days, you can go from a small lesion, like right over here, and then it spreads pretty much throughout the patient. Excuse me, so it can be a very deadly disease. Many people have died because of this, all right? So the most potent pathogen is Streptococcus pyogenes. Other bacteria can cause this, but the worst one to have is this one here, Streptococcus pyogenes. So in this case, what happens? That bacteria is invaded by a virus. So the virus actually has genes that code for these proteins. A protease destroys proteins and a superantigen, all right? But what happens here, the bacteria grows, it produces a bunch of different toxins, causes a very rapid prolific and degenerative response. So you're actually degenerating tissues here, all right? Of course, what's required is amputation. You can tell most of this person's leg is already gone. And this person probably would die. That person is too toxic of an environment. The worst bacteria to have is strains of Streptococcus pyogenes. There are other bacteria that can do this, but the worst one to have, when you hear about people dying from the flesh-eating disease, this is the organism they're dying from, all right? You can remove these tissues, so you can cut that out using a process called debridement. Debridement simply means removing infected tissues or dead tissues. And people do recover, don't get me wrong, but many people, of course, die, all right? Now, when it comes to necrotizing fasciitis, there are two forms, type 1 and type 2. So type 1 is polymicrobial. So poly means many. Many different bacteria involved with this process here. And there's, of course, type 2, which is monomicrobial. Only a single bacteria is causing this problem. And again, the worst one to have is Streptococcus pyogenes. Right? So look at me for a second. We talked about one organism. That organism is Streptococcus pyogenes. Primary disease when it comes to respiratory disease is strep throat. That was the first disease we talked about. Different strains, genetic strains of the same organism, can actually cause many other diseases. So I kind of mentioned scarlet fever, the erythrogenic toxin. I talked about rheumatic fever, acute glomerulonephritis, purple sepsis, erysipelas, flesh-eating disease, necrotizing fasciitis. All right, they are all diseases that are caused by the same organism. Now, I want to move on to the next organism on the list. And this organism causes a disease called diphtheria. You've probably heard about this disease before. In fact, if your parents were good to you, you go to your vaccination card, you're going to see DPT. You got a vaccine that protects you against this thing. Diphtheria, pertussis, or whooping cough, and then tetanus. All right? So let's talk about diphtheria. The organism that causes diphtheria is Corynebacterium diphtheriae. This is a gram-positive rod. All right, you see, this is a gram stain. Remember, purple and blue is gram-positive. This organism also has a virus. So here's the virus. This is a virus that infects this bacteria. That virus actually produces a toxin. And here's what I want you to know. That toxin inhibits protein synthesis. So basically, your cells die. All right? Here's what happens when somebody has diphtheria. Of course, this is an infection in the pharyngeal area, upper respiratory tract. This toxin kills cells. And of course, it causes cells to slough off. So one of the conditions we see, right? Don't forget it. Most cases of diphtheria, you have mucus and a buildup of dead cells here. That's called a pseudomembrane. All right? It's like little plasticky structure in the throat area. That's called a pseudomembrane. Why? I have mucus, I have cells, I have dead cells. They all get trapped in this, and they peel off, of course, to produce this pseudomembrane. Now, this toxin can circulate. So again, diphtheria, Corynebacterium diphtheria produces a toxin that inhibits protein synthesis. It can circulate in your system. And here's one thing it can cause. Right over here, you see inflammation. This is called bull neck. So if I say to you the word bull neck, you should be thinking this disease, diphtheria. All right? So the toxin floats around the system. It causes inflammation. In this case, both sides of the neck are actually inflamed. So this kid has diphtheria. The toxin can also damage the heart, and it actually destroys the sheets that wrap around axon. You guys remember Schwann cells? They wrap around axons, so they destroy the fatty sheets around nerves. All right? Again, don't worry about the mechanism. That's not for you. I do want you to remember this. The toxin prevents protein synthesis. That's what's shown here. So how do you treat patients with this disease? I use an antitoxin. You can use antibiotics. Antibiotics kill the bacterium cell. But of course, what's causing the problem is the toxin. So you use antibodies against the toxin. All right? Also, I'd like you to know this fact. There's a vaccine, a very effective vaccine for diphtheria.
And there are several names for it: DTAP, DTPA.